Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Judith Herman. Dr. Herman is a pioneering psychiatrist and one of the most influential voices in the field of trauma studies. As the author of the groundbreaking book Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, Dr. Herman has reshaped our understanding of trauma's impact on individuals and society, breaking silences that have persisted for decades. Her research introduced the concept of complex PTSD, expanding the framework for long-time trauma and offers new pathways for healing. Born at a time when psychiatry was a male-dominated field, Dr. Herman's career is a testament to resilience, intellect, and fierce dedication to justice. Inspired by her involvement in the feminist movement of the 1970s, she has been a tireless advocate for survivors of sexual violence and a voice for those often marginalized by medical and societal systems. Her work bridges the personal and the political, recognizing trauma as not only an individual experience, but a public health and human rights issue. As a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the director of training at the Victims of Violence program in Cambridge, Dr. Herman has mentored generations of trauma-focused clinicians and researchers. Her ability to blend rigorous scientific inquiry with deep empathy and compassion has earned her widespread acclaim, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society of Trauma Stress Studies. Beyond her academic and clinical contributions, Dr. Herman is celebrated for her humanity, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth. Her legacy continues to inspire mental health professionals, activists, and trauma survivors worldwide, offering not just understanding, but hope for recovery and transformation. Whether she is speaking to a room of scholars, guiding a patient through their healing journey, or pushing for systemic change, Dr. Herman remains a beacon of insight and compassion, a trailblazer who didn't just study trauma, but gave it language, visibility, and humanity. So, Dr. Herman, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
And thank you for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
It's my pleasure. Also, I did give a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Oh, okay. Well, let's see where to start. Probably relevant information is I'm a war baby. I was born in 1942, and so my worldview was shaped by that war growing up in the aftermath of that war. I'm also a second generation American-born child of Jewish immigrants from the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. All of my grandparents fled persecution in the old country, and then my parents also suffered political persecution during the McCarthy era. I'm what is known as a red diaper baby. So I certainly grew up with a very vivid awareness of the importance of human rights and social justice. And I was active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement of the 1960s when I was coming of age. And then out of those movements grew the second wave feminist movement, and that's where I really found my home. And my calling, if you will.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sorry that you and your family had to suffer those atrocities. And at the same time, I think because of the things that you have endured, it allowed you to have a voice and to share and to even become who you are today so that others can benefit from your knowledge and your wisdom and experience.
Well, yes, and of course, there's a direct line from the McCarthy era to what we're looking at today. Roy Cohn, who was the McCarthy's chief counsel, was also the mentor to our current president.
Mm. Wow, that's very telling, very telling. So, thank you for sharing that, and, also, I wanted to jump into a bit of your work because it has profoundly shaped how we understand trauma. So, if I may, I wanted to get a little bit more into the roots of your work, and I think that that can be done by looking back at your early life. And you expressed a little bit of history of what it was like for you early on, but I wanted to know when you were growing up, were there ever any moments that you feel set you on a path toward exploring the depths of human resilience and healing?
Well, my mother was a psychologist as a first generation American born. No, her mother left school after sixth grade, but her parents vowed that their children, women as well as men, boys as well as girls, would get a college education. And um, she did, and she got a doctorate in psychology and trained as a psychoanalyst. And so when I was going to college and uh, I told her I wanted to be a psychologist like her, she said, no, go to medical school. You'll have more power that way. Her father, by the way, the immigrant, had put himself through medical school working as a salesman and worked as a GP, a primary care doc on the Lower East Side, delivering babies on kitchen tables and that sort of thing.
Oh,
So,
wow.
it's the immigrant story, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Sure.
so she said, no, go to medical school. I mean, I'm named for my grandfather, Yehuda. So my fate was sealed at birth, basically. I
Mhm.
didn't know it. So I said, oh, okay. So I went to medical school. Women were 10% of my medical school class. The women in my class have all kept in touch. And then when I started my psychiatric residency in 1970, I was in a consciousness raising group at the same time. And I mean, my consciousness raising group was a bunch of white, college educated, privileged women. But even in that demographic, turned out there was a lot of sexual harassment, stalking, domestic violence. That's where the kind of awareness of the prevalence of violence against women that's how it was brought to light, was in these consciousness raising groups. Oh, and by the way, those were based on the groups that Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee ran in the Deep South in the civil rights movement, where they would bring people together just to talk about their lives and talk about the realities of what they were up against. Because the idea was, until you really know what people are dealing with, you can't think of a strategy of resistance. So anyway, I was getting an education about violence against women in my consciousness raising group. And then my very first two patients on the inpatient unit where I started my residency were women who had made serious suicide attempts.
Mhm.
And it turned out that both of them were incest survivors. And they'd never told anybody. And what do you know, when someone actually believed them and said that was a terrible thing that happened to you and you didn't deserve that, they got better. And
Mhm.
that kind of was an aha moment, if you will.
Sure. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I was gonna ask you also, like, did you feel any weight of like unspoken pain or secrets when you were a little girl growing up? Or even, I mean, the example you just showed, I think that that answers the question, but that may have been a different time. I guess as you were growing up and you didn't have the language for it yet, before the classes and before the school, just what did you feel in your body that you now know may have been unspoken pain or trauma as a little girl?
Well, I wouldn't call it trauma, but I mean, first of all, there certainly was a lot of fear. I was 11 when my parents were called before the McCarthy. Um, One of the scariest things that happened was that our passports were canceled. And I mean, the only thing they'd come to McCarthy's attention because my father was a classics professor, very radical, very subversive, taught at Brooklyn College. He had gotten a Fulbright fellowship to go to Italy. We were going to spend a year in Florence where he was going to look at ancient manuscripts. But the Fulbright fellowships were administered by the State Department, and McCarthy was investigating the deep state in the State Department. And so that's how they got hauled in. They canceled my father's Fulbright fellowship, but they also canceled our passports. And for American Jews who had just seen what went on in Germany, a lot of people kept their bags packed. And, when the big Red Scare happened and Jews were targeted, people kept a bag packed and a passport ready. And so having the passports canceled was scary. And of course, a lot of my father's colleagues and my mother's colleagues my mother was blacklisted. And so that was a scary time. So it wasn't an acute trauma, but I did know what it was like to be living in a fearful community. And then I guess the other thing that I did experience directly was sex discrimination,
Mhm.
particularly when, in medicine. I mean, I was told, for example, that when I applied for internships, a lot of places just said, "Oh, we don't take women," um, because these are very desirable positions, and you'd be taking one away from a breadwinner. And anyway, you're just going to get pregnant and have babies, and all this medical training is going to be wasted on you.
Wow.
And besides, and this was the kicker, what about that time of the month?
My God.
so,
Wow.
so so there was that kind of direct experience.
Mm. I couldn't even imagine hearing that now. Um, it's insane, but also, I mean, I guess that was the norm then, so it
Totally.
was just something that you had to deal with, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think that your experiences, having the discrimination being a woman and then with your consciousness group and seeing the women that had been victims of incestual rape, do you think that was what inspired you to kind of, be involved in the feminist movement and to study trauma early in your career?
Yes. I mean, I think what happened was, I mean, at that time, our basic psychiatry textbook, the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, estimated the prevalence of all forms of incest at 1 case per million population. Now, if that was true, what do you think are the odds that a rookie would get 2 cases in 2 weeks?
Wow.
So I started I and a colleague, Lisa Hirschman, started asking around just among therapists we knew whether they'd ever seen an incest case. And we collected 20 cases in no time. So we decided maybe we should write about this. I mean, it was either something was the matter with us, where it was, um, were we just attracting them for some reason, or maybe the textbook was wrong. So, and then the books about violence against women had started to come out. I think the first speak out on rape was in 1971, I think, 71. And Boston Area Rape Crisis Center was founded in 73. And, Susan Brown Miller's book, Against Our Will, came out in 75. And then I think that Nora Walker had a book called The Battered Woman. So all of the speak outs started leading, there were the consciousness raising groups and then the speak outs. And then the research and the books started coming out. And so people were documenting that rape was an experience of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women had experienced sexual assault, according to the criminal code definition. And none of this was ever talked about before. So that really, that path had already been opened up by the women's movement. And so incest seemed like the next logical thing to write about.
Mm. I think with rape being so prevalent and there not really being any consequences,
Well,
maybe is the word for it at the time, men probably felt like it was just something that they could do and just get
oh,
away with.
that's still
What
true, by the way. It's still an entitlement. You know what the conviction rate is compared to the prevalence of rape?
Mm,
I mean, about 5%.
wow.
Your odds of getting away with it are about 95%. Only
Mhm.
25% of victims report to the police because they know they're going to be treated as the suspect. Well, why did you go to that party? And what were you wearing? And how many drinks did you have? Unless it's a black stranger raping a blonde virgin. But that hardly ever happens because most people are, most rape victims are raped by somebody they know. So yeah, it's still, thanks to the Me Too movement, that certain notorious serial predators have now been held accountable. But the kind of casual fraternity rapists, not so much.
Mm. That's very disheartening and super sad. And I think that for it still to be so prevalent today, and there's so much, so many people are talking about it, so many movements have been in place. I can't imagine what it must have been like then. What
Yeah.
was it that gave you the courage to speak up?
Well, I wasn't alone.
Mm,
I had my sisters and brothers in the movement. We just called it the movement then. It was civil rights, anti-war, feminism was all kind of thought of as one human rights movement, if you will. And so that was the main thing. I wasn't alone. And then I did have the example of my parents, and I remembered all the dinner table conversations when I was a kid about who was putting up a fight and who was refusing to testify and who was caving in and naming names and all the kind of, a very similar kind of to the situation today, where a lot of people just went along with it, but a lot of people didn't. So I had that example as
mm.
well.
You kind of mentioned how the medical, I guess, community responded to women trying to, I guess, stake their claim on preferred jobs. What was the psychiatric community's reaction to you starting your work on trauma and sexual abuse when you first started to introduce it?
Well, it was mixed, I would say. There certainly was a lot of backlash, but there was also a lot of support. And I had good supervisors who encouraged me. I had good colleagues who encouraged me. And during the 1980s, my first book on father-daughter incest came out in 1981. And actually, I think it was on the strength of that I got invited to join the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital, it's a Harvard Medical School teaching hospital. It was a very innovative department at that time. It was, first of all, it's a public sector hospital. It's treats the people who have no money and um, all the patients that nobody else wants to treat. Um, and it had attracted a bunch of very innovative young psychiatrists who were interested in doing community psychiatry. And they, starting addiction programs. And they started programs for immigrants who only spoke Spanish or Portuguese or Haitian Creole. They started one of the first services for gay and lesbian patients. I mean, they were doing a lot of kind of innovative things. And then the city of Cambridge asked them to start a mental health service for crime victims. And so they hired my colleague, Mary Harvey, to get that up and running. And I joined her. And that's how we started the Victims of Violence program. And of course, it turned out that we've been seeing crime victims in our patient population all along. We just hadn't been asking about it. But yeah, a very large proportion of our patient population had histories of child abuse, sexual assault, sexual trafficking, domestic violence, and so on.
Okay, so you had support within the movement,
Within
and
and within my department.
okay, were there ever any times where even with the support, the resistance felt overwhelming, or when you felt like it was just too much? And if so, how did you stay resilient?
Well, there was a big backlash in the 1990s organized by this group called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I never did figure out where they got their money. My suspicion was that it was the sex industry, the pornography industry. They claimed that therapists were planting ideas in patients' head that they'd been abused as children, and that these were false memories and the culprits were therapists. Now that seems kind of far-fetched, but they got a lot of traction. They got a lot of elite professionals to join their board, and they got a lot of coverage in places like the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. And I think the press glommed onto this because they were tired of, for the last decade, they'd been doing stories that went, we always used to think that child sexual abuse was really rare, but now we've discovered that it's common. And they were tired of that. And so they glommed onto, actually, this is a moral panic, of false claims, and the therapists are the ones to blame for it. And therapists got sued, therapists got picketed, there were threats of violence and a bunch of stuff like that. So that was a rough time. I mean, what kept us going was having one another for support. And we wrote about it and we challenged those notions, and ultimately those arguments were discredited, but it took a while.
I'm glad you guys stayed resilient and you had community to build each other up, because
Yeah.
the work that you pioneered was a game changer. So um thank you for staying at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what keeps us going, I think, is that patients actually get better when they're given proper support.
Yeah,
And
indeed.
to see someone who was really struggling having a good life. That's very satisfying.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's gotta be very rewarding, especially when you see it over and over and over.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing we did besides develop individual therapy models was we did a lot of group therapy, a lot
Mhm.
of groups for trauma survivors. And those turn out to be wonderfully effective because, trauma shames and isolates people. And when you put survivors together in a group, they have a community. And they get one another. They really get it. And they have much more compassion for one another than they do for themselves. They say to one another, "No, you didn't deserve that." But when it comes to them, "Oh, but you see, I did this or I did that." And then the group will sort of challenge them. "Well, you don't feel that way about us. Why do you feel that way about you?" And so seeing people get reconnected and regain their sense of self-esteem and self-worth, that it just keeps you going.
Yeah. So, how would you personally define trauma based on your lived experience and all the individuals that you've helped and seen what trauma has done to their bodies, their relationships, and their nervous systems?
Well, I think there's, what we call big T trauma and then what we call little t trauma.
Mhm.
The big T trauma is the up close and immediate encounter with threat of death, threat of severe bodily harm, where, we'll say, "I saw that look in his eye and I thought, he's going to kill me." That's the kind of thing that produces PTSD. And if that happens over and over again, that's what you have a relationship of coercive control. And that's where you get the complex PTSD. And then there are little t traumas that are more about the sort of legacies of oppression more generally, where you may not have had direct experience of being beaten up by a cop, say, but you know lots of people who have. And you know that, I mean, the risks you run every single day just by being who you are. And then there are all the, or if you're growing up in a neighborhood with a lot of gang violence, um, or you're the child of a survivor,
Mhm.
you're dealing with with generational trauma.
Sure.
And those, it's clear that that also has an impact. It's not as extreme as the direct big T trauma exposure, but it's for real.
What type of impact can trauma have on the body? Whether it's big T trauma or little T trauma that happens over and over and over and to the point to where it becomes complex or has the same effect as a big T.
Well, we now know that there are multiple effects on the body, particularly for childhood adversities, some of which involve big T trauma. Some are more what we might call little t trauma. But there's a very well-known study that was conducted jointly by Kaiser Permanente in California and the CDC, where something close to 30,000 patients were given questionnaires about experiences of childhood adversities that included physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, having a parent with alcoholism or addiction, having a parent with severe mental illness, having a parent incarcerated. I think extreme poverty was one of the adversities. And anyway, it was just yes or no, not even how long did this go on, when did it begin, none of that subtlety, but just did this happen? Yes or no. And then they just counted up the scores of childhood adversities from 0 to, I don't know, 7 or 8. And it turned out that the childhood adversities were directly correlated with many of the 10 leading causes of death, including heart disease, lung disease, liver disease. Those 3 I know for sure. And the mediating factors were things like alcoholism, very high risk for alcoholism, very high risk for injection drug use, having 50 or more sexual partners, which either means being used in the sex trade or sexual compulsivity, suicidality, self-harm. And then besides all those leading causes of death, there have been, this was a retrospective study, but there have now been prospective studies of abused kids. There's one by my colleague Frank Putnam. He looked at sexually abused girls where the abuse had, and the subjects were referred by Child Protective Services, so these were confirmed cases that had been investigated and confirmed, and the kids were average age 10 when they joined the study. He's followed them for over 30 years, and now they're looking at the next generation. And these kids had multiple medical problems, including early puberty, obesity, dysregulation of the adrenal cortical axis, all kinds of hormonal dysregulation, and premature aging. So yeah, I mean, we're really just at the beginning of studying the profound bodily effects. But as I said, with the ACEs study, some adverse experiences seem to be more powerful than others, but even the small T trauma ones have an effect.
Mm. Is there a difference that's seen between childhood trauma and trauma that's suffered in adulthood?
Well, we don't have the same prospective studies for adults. We don't have, at least to my knowledge, I don't know of an adult cohort that's being followed as they age to see what their medical complications are. So I don't really know the answer to that question. But we certainly know that there are very frequent complications like alcoholism that have profound effects on the body as well.
Mm.
And the abnormalities of the adrenal cortical system also seem to be well documented.
You've written about how trauma just isn't an individual experience, but also a societal issue. So I wanted to ask you, how do systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, or poverty, compound the effects of trauma?
Well, for example, I forget the author, but there was a study of women who were in abusive relationships, were being abused by an intimate partner. And it looked at the amount of time, it took from first effort to seek help to successful from the abusive situation. And surprise, surprise, it turned out the more money the patient had and the more social resources the patient had, the faster they got out. I mean, a lot of women stayed in the relationship because they had 6 kids and no other income source. So I think that's a very dramatic example. But in general, social isolation is a predictor of the worst outcomes for trauma survivors. So the more social connections they have, the more community supports are available, the quicker they're going to get to safety and begin recovery.
Sure.
So I think the more you're in a targeted community or deprived community, the fewer resources you have for empowerment.
Sure. It's almost like you have to choose the lesser of two evils. Do you wanna be
Exactly.
homeless or do you wanna,
Exactly.
be abused?
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's unfair. That's very unfair. Very
Yeah.
sad too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've outlined 3 key stages of trauma recovery: safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. Can you walk us through these 3 stages and explain why each is so essential?
Well, I think the stages just make intuitive sense. If you're not in a safe situation, then you don't have post-traumatic stress disorder. You're still being traumatized every day. We're still at high risk. So before you can really begin recovery, you have to get at least to a relatively safe environment where, and they, of course, discovered that with combat veterans when they had PTSD. If you're a combat veteran with PTSD, you can't leave him at the front. You have to at least get him off the front lines to begin any kind of treatment. And safety is not an individual matter. Safety is always a social project. Nobody is safe in isolation. So you have to ask about things like money and housing and food.
Sure.
And I mean, one of the things I think one of the things that we did at the Victims of Violence program was we had victim advocates on our staff at the hospital, so that when a patient came in, they had someone who knew how to get a restraining order and could go to court
Mhm.
with them, and you know that kind of thing. So safety's first, and then once you've got that, and then people also have to be safe from themselves. If they are actively suicidal or self-harming or drinking or drugging or practicing unsafe sex at risk for HIV any minute,
Mhm.
you've got to address those issues as well. And often that's very complicated. So safety can happen quickly or it could take quite a while to establish. Once that's done, then you have a way to, if you have a kind of defensive perimeter, then you can begin to process what happened in the past, saying that was then, this is now. That
Mhm.
happened to me then, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. And so that's when you can go back and do the trauma processing in more depth and detail, and grieve the losses and make it just part of your life story instead of the whole life story. And so there's a bunch of work that gets done that's focused on the past, on the trauma. And then at a certain point, people feel like they're done with that. At least for now, they're done. And they're much more interested in what's going on now or what could happen in the future. And so then you return to the present and future, but it's with more of a proactive rather than a defensive kind of stance. And so that's when people can, enlarge their social networks and deepen their relationships and get involved in social action and that kind of thing.
Sure. Thank you for that. Um, a lot of people look at you as a hero, and you are very, very renowned for your work and for your courage and for the changes that you've made and just the way we see trauma, abuse, and so many other things. Do you ever stop and look and just smile and think about the things that you've done and the things that you've accomplished and how many people you've helped?
Well, yes, I do, and it's very gratifying. I do get wonderful feedback from people, and it's what keeps me going.
Mm.
One of the
So, with all the work that you've done to help others, what is it that you want people to know most?
well, two things I would say. One is we're in this together, and so these are huge problems, but we don't have to face them alone. And the other is a bit of, a pearl from my mama that I like to quote. She said that activism is the antidote to despair. And so I have tried to keep that in mind.
That's a good one. Thanks, Mama, for that. um, when it's all said and done, what is it that you want to be known for? What would you hope that your legacy is defined by?
Oh boy. I guess I would just want to be known as one of those people who tried to make a better world.
Mm.
And there are a lot of us out there.
Um, that's lovely. And quite frankly, that has already happened. So if that's what you want to be known
Well,
for,
we still got a lot of work to do, let's face
we
it.
do.
But, but um, that's the other thing is that when you do that, when you join with other people to try to make a better world, it's so inspiring. You meet the best of you're trying to. I mean, you're dealing with the problem of evil, right? You're trying to bear witness to the worst things that human beings are capable of,
Mm.
and you never hit the bottom of it. I mean, you think you've heard everything, and then some patient will tell you something that you just couldn't imagine in your wildest dreams. One human being would do to another human being, but when you're joining with other people, you see the best of what people can be, and it's such a wonderful community. Um, so that gives me hope.
And thank you for sharing that. All right, last question for you, Judith.
Yeah.
If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
Don't do it alone. Find someone who you can confide in, who you can trust. If you can't trust any human beings, how about a dog or a cat? But don't isolate. Let connect with someone.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for that. Thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for agreeing to do this with me. It's
Yes,
been
I'm
such an
happy to
honor.
this podcast. It's a real service.
I appreciate that. If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
I don't have I'm very 20th century. I don't have a website. I don't do social media, but people seem to be able to, use detective Google to track me down. So yes, I guess you just Google me and get an email.
What about your books?
Oh, books. Yes, books. Well, I have 3 books. Father-Daughter Incest, published by Harvard University Press. Trauma and Recovery, published by Basic Books. And Truth and Repair, my most recent book, 2023, also published by Basic Books, and that's about how trauma survivors envision justice. So it's about the fourth stage of recovery, if you will. And that there are 2 books for professionals about how to do groups for trauma survivors, and those are both published by Guilford.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Again, I just want to say how grateful I am to have this honor to sit with you, um, to be able to ask you questions, personal questions that you answer, to share space with you. So thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
And thank you. It's been a pleasure.